Yo! Greetings everyone, and welcome to the grand finale of the disturbing Wikipedia Iceberg by Aria Crown. Let's jump right into it. Mr. Cruel. Starting out our final tier, we have a notorious criminal wearing a terrifying mask who is never caught for his vicious crimes. Quote, Mr. Cruel is the moniker for an unidentified Australian serial child rapist who attacked 3 girls in the northern and eastern suburbs of Melbourne, Victoria in the late 1980s and early 1990s. He is also the prime suspect in the 1991 abduction and murder of a 4th girl, Carmine Chan. His moniker came from a headline in the Melbourne newspaper, The Sun. Mr. Cruel has never been identified, and his 3 confirmed attacks and the suspected murder remain unsolved cold cases. There is a reward of 200,000 Australian dollars for the 2 abductions. And in April 2016, 25 years after the death of Carmine Chan, Victoria Police increased the reward for the information that leads to the perpetrator's arrest and conviction from 100,000 Australian dollars to 1 million. Police describe Mr. Cruel as highly intelligent. He meticulously planned each attack, conducted surveillance on the victims and their families, ensured he left no forensic traces, protected his identity by covering his face at all times, and left red herrings to divert family and/or police's attention. He was soft-spoken, and his behavior was unhurried. During one attack, he took a break in a victim's house to eat a meal. He threatened to injure his victims or their family members with a knife or a handgun, unquote. Going into a little bit more detail over these specific crimes and abductions, quote, on the 22nd of August, 1987, in Lower Plenty, a man wearing a balaclava broke into a family home at 4 a.m., armed with a knife and a handgun. He tied the hands and feet of both parents and locked them in a wardrobe. He then tied the son to a bed and raped the 11-year-old daughter. He had cut the phone lines. Then, on the 27th of December 1988, in Ringwood, the same man broke into a family home via the back door at about 5:20 a.m., once again wearing a balaclava and armed with a handgun. He bound and gagged the parents and demanded money. He then grabbed their 10-year-old daughter, put tape over her eyes and a ball gag in her mouth, and abducted her. She was released 18 hours later on the grounds of Bayswater High School. Then, on the 3rd of July 1990 in Canterbury, he broke into a family home at 11:30 p.m., armed with a knife and gun, once again wearing a balaclava. He tied and gagged a 13-year-old girl, placed tape over her eyes, disabled the phones, and searched for money. He then drove her to another house and molested her for 50 hours before releasing her at a power substation in the suburb of Kew. Then finally, on the 13th of April, 1991, in Templestowe, a man wearing a balaclava broke into a family home at around 8:40 p.m., armed with a knife. He abducted 13-year-old Carmine Chan, who went to the same school as the Canterbury victim. Chan's decomposed body, with 3 gunshot wounds to the head, was found a year later. It has been reported that some detectives have doubts about whether this crime was also committed by Mr. Cruel. Detective Chris O'Connor answered a journalist's question in 2013 about whether Mr. Cruel was responsible, saying, "We just don't know if it was Mr. Cruel who murdered Carmine. We just can't be sure because there isn't isn't enough evidence to make a value judgment about whether it was or wasn't him in the Carmine case. Mr. Cruel is believed to have videotaped or perhaps taken still photographs of his attacks. Detectives believe that if he is still alive, he will have kept the tapes and or photos, and will still collect and possibly swap. They say he almost certainly continues to collect pornography through the internet and may communicate with children using chat lines. Mr. Cruel meticulously planned his crimes. For example, in one case, he abducted a girl and told her he would release her in exactly 50 hours, which he did. He bathed his victims carefully, with one victim describing the act as like a mother washing a baby, unquote. Truly a horrifying man, and one that could very likely still be alive and well somewhere out there, and who may never be caught. Bonus entry: Beast of Javadan, as suggested by Aboran7707. Quote, "The Beast of Javadan is a historic name associated with a man-eating animal, or animals that terrorized the former province of Javadan. The attacks, which covered an area spanning 90 by 80 kilometers, were said to have been committed by one or more beasts of a tawny, russet color, with dark streaks or stripes and a dark stripe down its back, a tail long as a wolf's, ending in a tuft, according to contemporary eyewitnesses. It was said to attack with formidable teeth and claws, and appeared to be the size of a calf or cow, and seemed to fly or bound across fields towards its victims. These descriptions from the period could identify the beast as a young lion, a striped hyena, a large wolf, a large dog, or a wolf dog, though its identity is still the subject of debate. The Kingdom of France used a considerable amount of wealth and manpower to hunt the animals responsible, including the resources of several nobles, soldiers, royal huntsmen, and civilians. The number of victims differs according to the source. A 1987 study estimated there had been 210 attacks, resulting in 113 deaths and 49 injuries. 98 of the victims killed were partly eaten. Other sources claim the animals or animals killed between 60 and 100 adults and children, and injured more than 30. The victims were often killed by having their throats torn out. The beast was reported killed several times before the attacks finally stopped. Several tales spoke of the beast's invulnerability. Indeed, hit by the bullets of reputedly skilled shooters, the beast would have risen each time. Testimonies attributed to the beast a gift of ubiquity. In a very short interval of time, it would have been seen in places several kilometers away. However, in many cases, these distances could be covered by a single animal. Two of the beast's most singular traits were its familiarity and its boldness. At least until Francois Antoine's departure, it did not seem to fear man. When it encountered resistance, it would move 40 paces away, sometimes sitting on its hindquarters for a few moments, and, if not pursued, would come back to the charge. Then it would move away at a walk or short trot. Several victims were attacked in the middle of villages, and most of the testimonies were related to attacks during the day. Finally, by showing a relentlessness that did not always seem dictated by hunger, the beast showed an astonishing aggressiveness. In addition, its unusual agility allowed it to jump over walls that a dog could not cross. The killing of the creature that eventually marked the end of the attacks is credited to a local hunter named Jean Chastel, who shot it at the slopes of Mount Mochette, now called Saint-Dover, during a hunt organized by the Marquis d'Apcher on the 19th of June, 1767. In 1889, Abbot Porcher told the edifying oral tradition, which said that the pious hero Chastel shot the creature after reciting his prayers, but the historical accounts do not report any such thing. The story about the large caliber bullets, homemade with Virgin Mary's medals, is a literary invention by the French writer Henri Porat. The body was then loaded onto a horse and brought to the Chateau de Besque of the Marquis d'Apcher, located in Charax, where it was necropsied by Dr. Boulanger, unquote. So yeah, unlike most other cryptids, this one was apparently real? Though it is still unknown what exactly the creature was. And furthermore, some modern interpretations of this story seem to believe that there was just a lot of wolf attacks that through mass hysteria formed into a myth that all these various attacks that were just done by packs of wolves were instead being done by one single creature. Though there is now no certain way to actually know about this. Still, quite the interesting and bizarre tale, all the same. And there's apparently going to be a film produced by Blumhouse based on this historical story as well, so that should be interesting, I suppose. Bonus entry, Caries vaccine. Okay, with this one, get ready for some very strange and interesting information. Quote, a Caries vaccine is a vaccine to prevent and protect against tooth decay. Streptococcus mutans, or S mutants, have been identified as the major etiological agent of human dental caries. The development of a vaccine for tooth decay has been under investigation since the 1970s, and in 1972, a caries vaccine was said to be in animal testing in England, and that it would have begun human testing soon. However, intrinsic difficulties in developing it, coupled with lack of strong economic interests, are the reasons why still no such vaccine is commercially available today. Several types of vaccines are being developed at research centers, with some kind of caries vaccine being considered to diminish or prevent dental caries impact on young people, unquote. In short, this page is about how there have been attempts and even successful attempts at making a vaccine which prevents tooth decay almost entirely, but has ultimately gone nowhere because there apparently was not a financial incentive to do so. Seems like such a thing would actually be fairly popular in addition to regular dentist checkups, but perhaps it would not be in the best interest of certain people to make something so easily available that may end up putting some out of work or make it significantly less lucrative for them. But then again, maybe such a vaccine would simply be rather dangerous, since it would have to go through a lot of testing and trials. So, who really knows? But it's interesting such a thing exists at all to begin with, and is almost never discussed pretty much anywhere. Bonus entry, Anatoly Slivko. Quote, Anatoly Yemelyanovich Slivko was a Soviet serial killer and necrophile who sexually assaulted, murdered, and mutilated 7 boys in and around Nevernomsk, Stavropol Krai, Russian SFSR between 1964 and 1985. He is also known to have sexually assaulted at least 36 other victims. Slivko's murder victims were aged between 11 and 15. All were deceived into participating in home movies, ostensibly reenacting the scene of a partisan soldier execution by Nazi soldiers, in which the boy would be hanged. Upon rendering his victim unconscious, Slivko would sexually assault and then murder and dismember his victim before setting the body alight. The entire routine would invariably be filmed, photographed, and documented in diaries to fuel Slivko's pyrophilia and erotic fantasies. The routine of hanging, mutilation, and burning enacted by Slivko was an attempt to recreate a traffic accident involving the violent death of a teenage boy he had witnessed in 1961, which had sexually aroused him and awakened his paraphilias. He would ultimately be sentenced to death in 1986, being executed by shooting on September 16, 1989, unquote. Those are the basic grisly details, but diving a bit deeper into Anatoly as a person, he was born on the 28th of December 1938 and was the oldest of 2 children born to impoverished parents. At the time of his birth, Ukraine was in the grip of famine caused by Joseph Stalin's forced collectivization of agriculture, which we noted in an earlier entry, from which Soviet Dagestan was not immune. The marriage between Slivko's parents was fraught. Both parents frequently argued. Furthermore, his father was also an alcoholic. Anatoly was an intelligent but somewhat sickly child who suffered from insomnia and several childhood illnesses. He was also a classic loner and later recalled his childhood as being blighted by instability, hunger, war, and poverty. When the Soviet Union entered the Second World War, Slivko's father was conscripted into the Red Army. Slivko himself witnessed many atrocities committed by the Nazis following their invasion of the Soviet Union, including their invasion of his own home in 1943, although one of his most graphic wartime memories was of seeking shelter with 4 other children in a cemetery to escape German bombing raids, only to be pushed aside by these children, who were repulsed by his emaciated appearance. According to Slivko, as he crouched into a ball, he observed the mutilated remains of a woman and a horse strewn across a nearby street. Later in life, he would begin his compulsory military service and was deployed in the Russian Far East. He was frequently subjected to the mockery and ridicule of his comrades, many of whom derided his timid and submissive personality. His superiors concluded Slivko was incompatible with military life, and he was eventually discharged from the Soviet Army, officially due to health issues in 1960. Then, quote, in 1961, Slivko witnessed a traffic accident in which a drunken motorcyclist swerved onto a pavement and into a group of pedestrians, fatally injuring a boy in his early teens who was wearing a young pioneer's uniform. For reasons Slivko would later insist he never could explain, this scene had sexually excited him, triggering a powerful orgasm. Slivko would later describe his witnessing of the traffic accident as one of the most pivotal moments in his life. Prior to witnessing the accident, he had repressed his sexuality. After witnessing the accident, he developed an overwhelming desire to engage in physical sexual relations with young males. Furthermore, the sight of blood on the teenager's shoes further compounded the shoe fetish that he already developed, and he began incorporating boys' footwear into his fantasies. Within months of witnessing the traffic accident, Slivko established a youth club in Nevonomysk. Ostensibly, the club was established to encourage local boys to participate in young pioneer activities, although Slivko also soon began using the club as a means of befriending boys and developing methods to gain their trust. This first club was destroyed in an act of arson approximately 1 year after its establishment. Allegedly, the perpetrator was one of the boys who attended the club and whom Slivko had either mistreated or molested. No criminal charges were filed, and shortly thereafter, Slivko established a new club, which he named Churgid. This youth club was based 3 miles from his home. Slivko's youth club activities aroused no suspicion, and in fact, the parents of boys who attended the club regularly bestowed praise upon him for devoting attention to their children and steering them away from trouble. Slivko regularly took his young charges on hiking and hill climbing expeditions, with the expeditions frequently lasting for days at a time. Articles relating to the club's activities frequently appeared within local newspaper and radio broadcasts. Slivko was also granted several interviews with local television outlets, and even received commendation from local Communist Party officials for his ongoing efforts to educate, entertain, and morally nurture the youth. In 1977, he was elected deputy of the city council and awarded the title of Honored Teacher of the Soviet Union. Then, by June 1963, Slivko had devised a routine whereby he would physically relieve the erotic fantasies sparked by the 1961 traffic accident. Once or twice a year, he would form a close friendship with a boy at the youth club, typically aged between 11 and 15, but never older than 17. The boy would be short for his age and would be wearing a young pioneer's uniform, just like the boy Slivko had seen die in the traffic accident. Slivko would gain the boy's confidence and tell him of an experiment he knew which involved a controlled hanging to stretch the spine to make them taller, essentially, and that he would be required to reenact the scene of a partisan executed by Nazi soldiers for his youth club as Slivko filmed the hanging, after which the boy was assured Slivko would relieve himself from his state of unconsciousness. Unquote. Thing is that Slivko would also take photographs and videotape these occurrences when he would render the boy unconscious and have his way with him. And over the course of 22 years, Slivko persuaded 43 boys to take part in his contrived experiment. And while this is already beyond disgusting and evil, vile beyond words, it of course got even worse when he began also murdering the boys as well. Slivko's behavior became violent once these victims were unconscious. He extensively dismembered their bodies, poured gasoline on their limbs and torso, and set their remains on fire to remind himself of the traffic accident which had sparked all of this to begin with. Slivko typically retained the victim's shoes as a memento, as well as the photographs and films which he developed in his home laboratory. He would end up claiming the lives of a 15-year-old runaway named Nikolai Dobryshev, as well as Alexei Kovalenko, 15-year-old Alexander Nesmyanov, 11-year-old Andrei Pogossian, 13-year-old Sergei Fatnev, 15-year-old Vyacheslav Kovishchik, and finally 13-year-old Sergei Pavlov, the final of which ended up leading to his arrest. As the article notes, quote, "Following Pavlov's disappearance, a local prosecutor named Tamara Langayeva began actively investigating the boy's absence. Her inquiries lasted several months, and by November 1985, Langayeva had discovered that several other boys who had attended the same youth club had also disappeared over the course of several years, often, like Pavlov, having informed their relatives they were to participate in home movies filmed by Slivko. Although Langayeva found no evidence of anything illegal in the way the club actually operated, her questioning of several boys did reveal that many members had agreed to being hung into unconsciousness in controlled experiments by Slivko as part of a repeated ritual for his homemade partisan movies. Many of these current and former members of the youth club had also suffered temporary amnesia following their revival. Confronted with the evidence recovered from his darkroom, Slivko began confessing to 7 murders and 36 non-fatal hangings on the 28th of December. He blamed his crimes on distress brought upon by his sexual frustration and emphasized the primary purpose of his retaining the snuff material and paraphernalia was to fuel his erotic fantasies and to relieve his tension, unquote. In the end, Slivko pleaded not guilty to the charges, claiming all 7 deaths were accidental. He was, of course, found guilty of all charges and sentenced to death, and would end up being executed via a single gunshot to the back of the head on September 16th, 1989. May he rest in shit and piss forever. Bonus entry: Tokyo Rose. Quote, "Tokyo Rose was a name given by Allied troops in the South Pacific during World War II to all female English-speaking radio broadcasters of Japanese propaganda. The programs were broadcast in the South Pacific and North America to demoralize Allied forces abroad and their families at home by emphasizing troops' wartime difficulties and military losses. Several female broadcasters operated using different aliases and in different cities throughout the territories occupied by the Japanese Empire, including Tokyo, Manila, and Shanghai. The name Tokyo Rose was never actually used by any Japanese broadcaster, but it first appeared in the US newspapers in the context of these radio programs during 1943. During the war, Tokyo Rose was not only one individual, but rather a group of largely unassociated women working for the same propagandist effort throughout the Japanese Empire. In the years soon after the war, the character Tokyo Rose, whom the Federal Bureau of Investigation, or FBI, now refers to be mythical, became an important symbol of Japanese villainy for the United States. American cartoons, movies, and propaganda videos between 1945 and 1960 tend to portray her as sexualized, manipulative, and deadly to American interests in the South Pacific, particularly by revealing intelligence of American losses in radio broadcasts. Similar accusations concern the propaganda broadcasts of Lord Haw-Haw and Axis Sally, and in 1949, the San Francisco Chronicle described Tokyo Rose as the Mata Hari of radio. Tokyo Rose ceased to be merely a symbol during September 1945, when Iva Koguri Diaquino, a Japanese-American disc jockey for a propagandist radio program, attempted to return to the United States. Koguri was accused of being the real Tokyo Rose, arrested, tried, and became the 7th person in U.S. history to be convicted of treason. Koguri was eventually paroled from prison in 1956, however, but it was more than 20 years later that she received an official presidential pardon for her role in the war, unquote. Wow, so that's a lot of stuff to take in. Firstly, when I read the part about Tokyo Rose becoming a sort of mythical character for cartoons and the like, I decided to look into just that to find any info I could on what depictions were like of this concept they created. And I found one such example from the 1945 Warner Bros. Animated short titled Tokyo Woes, which I'll showcase a clip from here.
It's now give honorable Japanese announcer great pleasure to present Tokyo Rose.
Yeah, I also looked into the other two characters they listed, Lord Haha and Axis Sally, since they also sounded rather interesting. Lord Haha, as noted in his own wiki article, is, quote, a nickname applied to William Joyce and several other people who broadcast Nazi propaganda, United Kingdom from Germany during the Second World War. The broadcast opened with Germany calling, spoken in an affected upper-class English accent. The same nickname was also applied to some other broadcasters of English-language propaganda from Germany, but it is Joyce with whom the name is overwhelmingly identified, unquote. The aim of these broadcasts were to discourage and demoralize American, Australian, British, and Canadian troops, and the British population in general, to suppress the effectiveness of the Allied war effort through propaganda, and to motivate the Allies to agree to peace terms leaving the Nazi regime intact and in power. Among many techniques used, the Nazi broadcasts reported on the shooting down of Allied aircraft and sinking of Allied ships, presenting discouraging reports of high losses and casualties among Allied forces. Although the broadcasts were well known to be Nazi propaganda, they frequently offered the only details available from behind enemy lines concerning the fates of friends and relatives who did not return from bombing raids over Germany. As a result, Allied troops and civilians frequently listened to Lord Haha's broadcasts, despite the often inflammatory content and frequent inaccuracies and exaggerations, in the hope of hearing clues as to the fate of Allied troops and air crews. And in case you're wondering, the reason he was called Lord Haha was because, quote, in a newspaper article of the 14th of September 1939, the radio critic Jonah Barrington of the Daily Express wrote of hearing a gent moaning periodically from Ziesen, who speaks English of the Haha, damn it, get out of my way variety. 4 days later, he gave him the nickname Lord Haha. He wrote scathingly, I imagine him with a receding chin, a questioning nose, thin, yellow hair brushed back, a monocle, a vacant eye, a gardenita in his buttonhole, rather like P.G. Wodehouse's Bertie Wooster, unquote. Also, he was also made fun of in a Warner Bros. Cartoon depicting him as a donkey, as you can see here. Now, as for Axis Sally, that was the generic nickname given to women, radio personalities who broadcast English language propaganda on behalf of the European Axis powers during World War II. This included the likes of Mildred Gillers, who was the first woman in U.S. history to be convicted of treason, and Rita Zuka. But out of that realm and back into the story of Tokyo Rose and the sadly tragic story of Iva Toguri. Quote, although she broadcast using the name Orphan Anne, Iva Toguri has been known as Tokyo Rose since her return to the United States in 1945. an American citizen and daughter of Japanese immigrants, Toguri traveled to Japan to tend to a sick aunt just prior to the attack on Pearl Harbor. Unable to leave the country when war began with the United States, and unable to stay at her aunt's family as an American citizen, and unable to receive any aid from her parents who were placed in internment camps in Arizona, Toguri eventually just accepted a job as a part-time typist at Radio Tokyo with no other options left. She was quickly recruited as a broadcaster for the 75-minute propagandist program, The Zero Hour, which consisted of skits, news reports, and popular American music. According to the studies conducted during 1968, of the 94 men who were interviewed and who recalled listening to The Zero Hour while serving in the Pacific, 89 recognized it was propaganda, and less than 10% felt demoralized by it. 84% of the men listened because the program had good entertainment, and one GI remarked, "Lots of us thought that she was on our side all along." After World War II ended in 1945, the US military detained Toguri for a year before releasing her due to a lack of evidence. Department of Justice officials agreed that her broadcasts were innocuous, but when Toguri tried to return to the United States, an uproar ensued because Walter Winchell, a powerful broadcasting personality, and the American Legion lobbied relentlessly for a trial, prompting the FBI to renew its investigation of Toguri's wartime activities. Her 1949 trial resulted in a conviction on one of 8 counts of treason. In 1974, investigative journalists found that important witnesses had asserted that they were forced to lie during the testimony. They stated that the FBI and US occupation police had coached them for more than 2 months about what they should say on the stand, and that they had been threatened with treason trials themselves if they did not cooperate. US President Gerald Ford pardoned Toguri in 1977 based on these revelations and earlier issues with the indictment. Unquote. It's a sad hand that Iva was dealt, one of many poor souls caught up in the tidal wave of war, and the racism that followed suit because of it, and the lies by the government, all for the sake of defeating a mythical figure for the public, this Tokyo Rose. In her later life, the World War II Veterans Committee awarded Toguri its annual Edward J. Hurley Citizenship Award, citing her indomitable spirit, love of country, and the example of courage she has given her fellow Americans. And according to one biographer, Toguri found it to be one of the most memorable days of her life. Toguri died of natural causes in a Chicago hospital on September 26 of 2006, at the age of 90. Lynching postcard. Quote, "A lynching postcard is a postcard bearing the photograph of a lynching, a vigilante murder usually motivated by racial hatred, intended to be distributed, collected, or kept as a souvenir. Often, a lynching postcard would be inscribed with a racist text or poems. Lynching postcards were in widespread production for more than 50 years in the United States, although their distribution through the United States Postal Service was banned in 1908. Hair lynching, as a display of racial domination, peaked around the 1880s through the 1940s, and were less frequent until the 1970s, especially but not exclusively in the southern United States. Lynchings were widely used to intimidate recently emancipated African Americans after the Civil War Reconstruction era, and were later used to intimidate voters and civil rights workers of all ethnic groups. Mostly African American men, women, and children were lynched for a lack of subservience or for success success in business. Others were often accused of crimes and forcibly removed from their homes or jails, to be murdered by a white supremacist mob without due process or presumption of innocence. Spectators sold one another souvenirs including postcards. Often the photographer was one of the killers. In a typical lynching postcard, the victim is displayed prominently at the center of the shot, while smiling spectators, often including children, crowd the margins of the frame, posing for the camera to prove their presence. Facial expressions suggesting remorse, guilt, shame, or regret are rare, unquote. That's the basic gist of this atrocious practice. And there are some unfortunate examples one can find on this Wikipedia page and far beyond this. But I obviously won't be showing you any of that here in this video. But it is, all the same, truly haunting, racist, and evil shit. The Dnipropetrovsk Maniacs, or Three Guys, One Hammer. This one is quite infamous for a reason. Quote, the Dnipropetrovsk Maniacs are Ukrainian serial killers responsible for a string of murders in Dnipropetrovsk in June and July of 2007. The case gained additional notoriety because the killers made video recordings of some of the murders, with one of the videos leaking onto the internet. Two 19-year-olds, Viktor Seiniko, born the 1st of March in 1988, and Igor Suprunyuk, born of the 20th of April 1988, were arrested and charged with 21 murders. The third conspirator, Alexander Hanza, born February 1988, was charged with 2 armed robberies that took place before the murder spree. On the 11th of February 2009, all 3 defendants were found guilty, with Seneko and Suprunyuk being sentenced to life imprisonment, while Hanza received 9 years in prison, unquote. Now, there's a lot of details to this case, and honestly, I highly suggest watching a fuller video to get the full depth of the atrocities these 3 young men caused on so many people. But the basics are, they would go around recording themselves violently killing people unsuspectingly, usually with a hammer. There was no rhyme or reason to any of the murders. In fact, it really seemed as though the motive for this was just senseless killing for the sake of it, because they seemed to find it entertaining, enjoyed the thrill of the hunt, that sort of shit. And in fact, they were so relentless, once they killed the first person, they end up killing the second victim on the same day. And while I'd rather not go into all the gritty details of all that, I will talk about the namesake for this entry, the Three Guys, One Hammer video, which of the multiple videos that the group recorded for their murders, this one was actually leaked onto the internet, in which case it showed the murder of 48-year-old Sergei Yatsenko. He is seen lying on his back in a wooden area, and is struck repeatedly in the face with a hammer held inside a plastic bag. One attacker stabs Yatsenko in the eye and abdomen with a screwdriver, and Yatsenko is then struck with a hammer to ensure that he is dead. The attack lasts just over 4 minutes, during which the victim lapses in and out of consciousness. One murderer is seen smiling at the camera during the video, and then the murderers walk back to their car, showing that the crime took place close to the side of the road, next to their parked car. They discuss the murder calmly, expressing mild surprise that the victim was still breathing after a screwdriver was plunged into his exposed brain. The suspects then wash their hands and the hammer with a water bottle and begin to laugh. Only 2 suspects appear to be present in the video, with one always behind the camera. The 3 young men were also found in possession of multiple photographs showing them attending the funerals of the victims. They can then be seen smiling and flipping off the coffins and gravestones. There is also evidence of animal abuse that was also shown to the court, with the suspects posing alongside mutilated animal corpses, unquote. As noted before, they were ultimately sentenced to life in prison. Well, 2 of the murderers, not the man behind the camera, who instead served 9 years and is actually currently out of prison and married with 2 kids. This case has lived on in the minds of many, due to not only the brutality and the amount of innocent people these evil men killed, but also for the leaked video, Three Guys, One Hammer, that has been shared around on gore sites and the like for some time now. It is often considered one of the most brutal of its sort to watch. It goes without saying, but it's never a good idea to seek out these sort of videos, and I would highly recommend never doing so. But it is nevertheless a truly stomach-churning look into the minds, mentality, and actions of purely evil individuals. The Nanjing Massacre. Quote, the Nanjing Massacre, or the Rape of Nanjing, was a mass murder of Chinese civilians in Nanjing, the capital of the Republic of China, immediately after the Battle of Nanjing and the retreat of the National Revolutionary Army in the Second Sino-Japanese War by the Imperial Japanese Army. Beginning on December 13, 1937, the massacre lasted 6 weeks, and the perpetrators also committed other war crimes such as mass rape, looting, torture, and arson, and the massacre is considered to be one of the worst wartime atrocities. And as an example of the atrocities, in 1937, the Osaka Mainichi Shimbun and its sister newspaper, the Tokyo Nichi Shimbun, covered a contest between two Japanese officers, Toshiaki Mukai and Tsuyoshi Noda of the Japanese 16th Division. The two men were described as vying to be the first to kill 100 people with a sword before the capture of Nanjing. From Jurong to Tangshan, two cities in Jiangsu Province, China, Mukai had killed 89 people, while Noda had killed 78. The contest continued because neither had killed 100 people, and by the time they had arrived in Jin Mountain, Noda had killed 105 people, while Mukai had killed 106. Both officers supposedly surpassed their goal during the heat of battle, making it impossible to determine which officer had actually won the contest. Therefore, they decided to begin another contest to kill 150 people. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East estimated that in the first month of the occupation, Japanese soldiers committed approximately 20,000 cases of rape in the city. Some estimates claim 80,000 cases of rape, and according to the International Military Tribunal, the Far East, spear of all ages, including children and elderly women, were commonplace, and there were several instances of sadistic and violent behavior related to these spear. Following the spear, many women were killed and their bodies were mutilated, and a large number of these spear were done systematically by the Japanese soldiers as they went from door to door, searching for girls, with many women being captured and gang raped. Japanese soldier Takakura Kozu recalled, women suffered most, no matter how young or old. They all could not escape the fate being we sent out coal trucks to the city streets and villages to seize a lot of women, and then each of them was all allocated to 15 to 20 soldiers for sexual intercourse and abuse. After raping, we would also kill them. Unquote. These women, after these heinous acts, would often go through explicit mutilation, such as the penetrating of their genitals with bayonets, long sticks of bamboo, or other objects. And frequently, mothers had to watch their babies beheaded and to be submitted to these atrocious acts. I could go on, and what makes this article so hard to read through is beyond the pure depravity of the genocide. There are heaps and heaps of pictures of many of these crimes, from the mass graves to the deformed and destroyed bodies of their victims, men, women, and children, showcased throughout the article, all of which I can of course not show you at all, nor would I personally want to. The massacre remains a wedge issue in Sino-Japanese relations to this day. Historical revisionists and nationalists, as well as government officials in Japan, have either denied or minimized the massacre, despite the overwhelming evidence. Truly one of the worst and most barbaric mass genocides ever documented, and a haunting look at the old Japanese Empire and what it was capable of, and how truly evil mankind as a whole can be. Bonus entry: Sudden Arrhythmic Death Syndrome. Quote, sudden arrhythmic death syndrome, or SADS, is a sudden, unexpected death of adolescents and adults caused by a cardiac arrest. However, the exact cause of the cardiac arrest, and thus the exact cause of death, is unknown. These deaths occur mainly during sleep or at rest. One type of conduction defect known as Brugada syndrome can be responsible. And on the note of Brugada syndrome, or BRS, is a genetic disorder in which the electrical activity of the heart is abnormal due to channelopathy. It increases the risk of abnormal heart rhythms and sudden cardiac death. Those affected may have episodes of syncope. The abnormal heart rhythms seen in those of Brugada syndrome often occur at rest. They may be triggered by a fever. Back on to SADS, the syndrome is rare in most areas around the world, but occurs in populations that are culturally and genetically distinct. It was first noted in 1977 among Southeast Asian Hmong refugees in the United States and Canada. The syndrome was again noted in Singapore when a retrospective review of records showed that 230 otherwise healthy Thai foreign workers living in Singapore died suddenly of unexplained causes between 1982 and 1990, unquote. So yeah, in case you didn't know, you could be perfectly healthy with no major health issues and just chilling out when you suddenly just fucking die. So yeah. Bonus entry. The killing of Tim McLean. Quote, on July 30th, 2008, Tim McLean, a carnival barker, was returning home to Winnipeg after working at a fair in Edmonton. He departed Edmonton on board a Greyhound bus to Winnipeg via a Yellowhead highway through Saskatchewan. He sat at the rear, one row ahead of the toilet. At 6:55 p.m., the bus departed from the stop in Erickson, Manitoba, with a new passenger, Vince Lee. Lee was described as a tall man in his 40s, with a shaved head and sunglasses. First sat near the front of the bus, then moved to sit next to McLean after a scheduled rest stop in Brandon. McLean barely acknowledged Lee, then fell asleep against the window pane, headphones covering his ears. According to witnesses, McLean was sleeping with his headphones on when the man sitting next to him suddenly produced a large knife and began stabbing him in the neck and chest. After the attack began, the bus driver pulled to the side of the road, and he and all the other passengers fled the vehicle. The driver and the two other men tried to rescue McLean, but were chased away by Lee, who slashed at them from behind the locked bus doors. Lee decapitated McLean and displayed his severed head through the window to those standing outside the bus, then returned to McLean's body and began severing other parts and consuming some of McLean's flesh. Witnesses stated that this went on for hours. At 8:30 p.m., the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, or RCMP, received a report of a stabbing on a Greyhound bus west of the city. They arrived to find the suspect still in the bus, being prevented from escaping by another passenger, the bus driver, and a truck driver, who provided a crowbar and a hammer as weapons. The other passengers were huddled at the roadside, some of them crying and vomiting. Because the suspect had tried to drive the bus away, the driver had engaged the emergency immobilizer, rendering the vehicle inoperable, unquote. Eventually, the police were in a standoff with the suspect, with special negotiators and heavily armed tactical unit all surrounding the bus. Lee even apparently noting that he'll have to stay on this bus forever. However, on the 31st of July, 2008, at 1:30 a.m., Lee tried to leave the bus by breaking through a window, and the RCMP arrested Lee soon afterward. He was shot twice with a taser, handcuffed, and put in the back of a police cruiser. Parts of the victim's body, placed in plastic bags, were retrieved from the bus. His ear, nose, and tongue were found in Lee's pockets. And the victim's eyes and part of his heart were never recovered, and in spite of his vehement denial, are presumed to have been eaten by Lee. Meanwhile, the stranded passengers were taken from the scene to be interviewed at the Brandon RCMP detachment, and on the 31st of July 2008 at 10 a.m., Greyhound representatives took the other passengers to a local store to replace their clothes, which remained on the bus. They arrived in Winnipeg at 3:30 p.m. that day to be reunited with their family members and friends. Garnet Caton, a witness, said the attacker seemed unaware of others when the stabbing occurred, adding he was struck by Lee's calm demeanor. There was no rage or anything. He was like a robot stabbing the guy, he said. Later, when he appeared in the Portage la Prairie courthouse on charges of second-degree murder, the only words Lee reportedly uttered were, "Please kill me." Lee's trial commenced on the 3rd of March 2009, with Lee pleading not criminally responsible on account of mental disorder. Stanley Yaren said that his patient's schizophrenia rendered him inculpable, as he had been under the false belief that McLean was a force of evil and posed an immediate threat to himself and others. In Lee's mind, McLean was really a demon in disguise and an alien who needed to be destroyed, to the point where he felt it necessary to mutilate McLean's body to prevent him from coming back to life. Lee had also been pressured to perform the attack by voices he believed were from God, telling him to kill McLean sitting beside him, or he would be killed himself. Both the defense and the prosecution were in agreement that Yaren's assessment and spoke in favor of involuntary commitment to a mental institution rather than prison time. The presiding judge, John Scurfield, accepted the diagnosis and ruled Lee was not criminally responsible for the killing. Lee was remanded to the Selkirk Mental Health Center, unquote. Certainly one of the most violent and random cases of murder and cannibalization that can be found. Bonus entry: Quantum Death. Quote, quantum death is a thought experiment in quantum mechanics and the philosophy of physics. Purportedly, it can falsify any interpretation of quantum mechanics other than the Everett many worlds interpretation by means of variation of the Schrodinger's cat thought experiment, but from the cat's point of view. Quantum immortality refers to the subjective experience of surviving quantum states. So this concept is sometimes conjectured to be applicable to real-world causes of death as well, unquote. Now first, before we go any further, let me note what Schrodinger's cat is, in case you don't know what that is, because it'll make the following thought experiment make a lot more sense. Quote, in quantum mechanics, Schrodinger's cat is a thought experiment concerning quantum superposition. In the thought experiment, a hypothetical cat can be considered simultaneously alive and dead, while it is unobserved in a closed box, as a result of its fate being linked to a random subatomic event that may or may not occur. This experiment, viewed this way, is described as a paradox. In Schrodinger's original formulation, a cat, a flask of poison, and a radioactive source are placed in a sealed box. If an internal radiation monitor detects radioactivity, a single atom decaying, the flask is shattered, releasing the poison, which kills the cat. The Copenhagen interpretation implies that, after a while, the cat is simultaneously alive and dead. Yet when one looks in the box, one sees the cat either alive or dead, not both alive and dead. This poses the question of when exactly quantum superposition ends and reality resolves into one possibility or the other. Although originally a critique on the Copenhagen's interpretation, Schrodinger's seems paradoxical thought experiment became part of the foundation of quantum mechanics. The scenario is often featured in theoretical discussions of the interpretations of quantum mechanics, particularly in situations involving the measurement problem. As a result, Schrodinger's cat has had an enduring appeal in popular culture. Note, the experiment is not intended to actually be performed on a cat, but rather as an easily understandable illustration of the behavior of atoms, unquote. In other words, until you open the box to confirm if the theoretical cat is alive or dead, it exists in a strange plane of both being alive and dead, since no one actually knows for sure. Now back to quantum death. Basically, the experiment would go something like this. A man would sit in front of a gun. This gun is rigged to a machine that measures the spin of a quantum particle. Each time the trigger is pulled, the spin of the quantum particle, or quark, is measured. Depending on the measurement, the gun will either fire or it won't. If the quantum particle is measured as spinning in a clockwise motion, the gun will fire. If the quark is spinning counterclockwise, the gun won't go off. There'll only be a click. So, the man pulls the trigger, the gun clicks. He pulls the trigger again, click, and again, click. The man will continue to pull the trigger again and again, with the same result. The gun won't fire. Although it's functioning properly and loaded with bullets, no matter how many times he pulls the trigger, the gun will never fire. He'll continue this process for eternity, becoming immortal. Go back in time to the beginning of the experiment though. The man pulls the trigger for the very first time. The quark is now measured as spinning clockwise. The gun fires, the man is dead. Simple, right? But the thing is, the man already pulled the trigger the first time, and an infinite amount of times following that, and we already know that the gun didn't fire. How can the man be dead? The man is unaware, but he's both alive and dead. Each time he pulls the trigger, the universe is split in two. It will continue to split again and again, each time the trigger is pulled. One where the man died, and the other where the man lived. So yeah, a pretty interesting thought experiment, and while I'm kind of simplifying things and you can go far, far deeper into the details of it, it is nonetheless, pretty interesting. Zoo sadism. Okay, get ready for this one, because this is one of the most disgusting and cruel entries on the iceberg, and possibly just in general for any of these icebergs. Quote, zoo sadism is a sexual pleasure derived from cruelty to animals. It is a paraphilia where people are sexually aroused by torturing animals. Zoo sadism is part of the McDonald triad, a set of 3 behaviors that is considered a precursor to psychopathic behavior, unquote. The other 2 being arson and bedwetting past the age of 5, strangely enough, in case you're wondering. Serial killers such as Ted Bundy and Jeffrey Dahmer were known for torturing and killing animals in their youth. And beyond the fact that killing and torturing animals is beyond fucked up, there is sadly a community of freaks for this act online. Freaks who love coming together and making content such as videos and photographs of them slowly torturing and killing animals, and often also sexually assaulting dead animals as well, both before and after killing them. There isn't a whole lot else to talk about in regards to this entry because it's basically is what it is on the tin. It's fucked up beyond belief and it exists, and now you gotta know that it exists in case you didn't know. But if you do want to know more about this dark rabbit hole and the sort of disgusting freaks that got involved into this, and some of their fates as well online, out of a sort of morbid curiosity, then I can recommend the YouTube video trilogy on the topic by Cecil McFly, which I will warn you now, despite obviously her not showing any images ever of any of the beyond fucked up things and actions that are being described, it is still one of the hardest couple of videos that I have ever watched in my life. But it is all the same still very worthwhile noting, and a showcase at these lowlives, since they don't deserve to get away with all the evil actions that they did to these poor animals. Hurtcore. Right, from one of the most disturbing, disgusting rabbit holes you could ever learn about, right into the next. Quote, hurtcore is a portmanteau of the words hardcore and hurt, and is the name given to a particularly extreme form of usually involving degrading violence, bodily harm, and torture relating. Eileen Ormsby, Australian writer and author of The Darkest Web, described hurtcore as a fetish for people who get aroused by the infliction of pain or even torture on another person who is not a willing participant. An additional motivation for the perpetrator, next to their position of power over their victims, can be the reaction of their victims to the physical abuse, like crying or screaming of pain. This reaction can stimulate the arousal of the perpetrator even more. Some dark web forums are dedicated to the discussion and sharing of images and videos of hurtcore. And in 2013, Vice called Hurt to the Core the dark web's most notorious hurtcore site, run by Matthew Graham, who became known as the king of hurtcore, as well as one of the biggest and hurtcore distributors in the world. The case of Matthew Falder was the UK National Crime Agency's first successful hurtcore prosecution, unquote. So yeah, that's what that is. I think you more than get the idea of this and why those who make and consume this sort of content should get some help. And by help, I mean a bullet in each one of their balls and one in their brain. Bonus entry, John Money. So this one is quite infamous. A case of a psychologist cruelly destroying the lives of 2 innocent children. Quote, John William Money was a New Zealand-American psychologist, sexologist, and professor at Johns Hopkins University, known for his research on human sexual behavior and gender, believing that gender identity was malleable within the first 2 years of life. Money advocated for the surgical normalization of the genitalia of intersex infants, unquote. He also was the one who coined the terms gender role and sexual orientation, and is generally the man behind the concept of gender being separate from sex. This would lead into an unfortunately extremely terrifying experiment. Quote, in 1966, a botched circumcision left 8-month-old Raymer without a penis. Money persuaded the baby's parents that sex reassignment surgery would be in Raymer's best interest, and at the age of 22 months, Raymer underwent an orchiectomy in which his testicles were surgically removed. He was reassigned to be raised as female, and his name changed from Bruce to Brandon Brenda. Money further recommended hormone treatment, to which the parents agreed. Money then recommended a surgical procedure to create an artificial vagina, which the parents refused. Money published a number of papers reporting the reassignment was successful. David Raymer was raised under the optimum gender rearing model, which was the common model for sex and gender socialization, medicalization for intersex youth. The model was heavily criticized for being sexist and for assigning an arbitrary gender binary. According to John Colapinto's biography of David Raymer, starting when Raymer and his twin Brian were 6 years old, Money showed the brothers pornography and forced the two to rehearse sexual acts. Money would order David to get down on all fours, and Brian was forced to come up behind him and place his crotch against his buttocks. Money also forced Raymer in additional sexual positions, in which his legs spread, with Brian on top. On at least one occasion, Money took a photograph of the two children performing these acts. When either child resisted Money, Money would get angry. Both Raymer and Brian recall that Money was mild-mannered around their parents, but ill-tempered when alone with them. Money also forced the two children to strip or genital inspections. When they resisted inspecting each other's genitals, Money got very aggressive. Raymer says, "He told me to take off my clothes, and I just did not do it. I just stood there, and he screamed, 'Now,' louder than that. I thought he was going to give me a whooping, so I took my clothes off and stood there shaking." Colapinto speculates that Money's rationale for this treatment of the children was his belief that childhood sexual rehearsal play at thrusting movements and copulation was important for a healthy adult gender identity. Brian spoke about the therapy only with the greatest emotional turmoil, and David was unwilling to speak about the details publicly. At 14 years old and in extreme psychological agony, David Raymer was told the truth by his parents, and he chose to begin calling himself David, and he underwent surgical procedures to revert the female bodily modifications. Despite the pain and turmoil of the brothers, for decades, Money reported on Raymer's progress as his John Joan case, describing apparently successful female gender development, and using this case to support the feasibility for sex reassignment and surgical reconstruction, even in non-intersex cases. By the time his deception was discovered, the idea of a purely socially constructed gender identity and infant intersex medical interventions had become the accepted medical and sociological standard. In July of 2002, Brian was found dead from an overdose of antidepressants, and in May of 2004, David committed suicide by shooting himself in the head with a sawed-off shotgun at the age of 38. According to his mother, he had recently become depressed after losing his job and separating from his wife. Unquote. Truly horrifying shit. And in the end, John Money got away with all this evil with no real repercussions, nor the parents for allowing this to happen either. Children being used for a cruel experiment, perversion and child exploitation. A pedophile who got away with it all in the name of science. May both David and Brian Raymer rest in peace. Cruel Onion Wiki. And for our final entry, we have a rather interesting page, that of the list of Tor onion services, which, as the page notes, quote, is a categorized list of notable onion services, formerly hidden services, accessible through the Tor anonymity network. Defunct services and those accessed by depreciated V2 addresses are marked, unquote, which is interesting because it holds information about some of the most niche, strange, and fucked up communities that found their home on Tor, or as some have dubbed it, the dark web. Some examples of this are the Silk Road, which was an online black market, and the first modern darknet market, which was launched in 2011 by its American founder Ross Ulbricht under the pseudonym Dread Pirate Roberts. As part of the dark web, Silk Road operated as a hidden service on the Tor network, allowing users to buy and sell products and services between each other anonymously. All transactions were conducted with Bitcoin, a cryptocurrency which aided in protecting user identities. The website was known for its illegal drug marketplace, among other illegal and legal product listings. Between February 2011 and July 2013, the site facilitated sales amounting to over 9 million bitcoins. In October 2013, the FBI shut down the Silk Road website and arrested Ulbricht. Silk Road 2.0 came online the next month, run by other administrators of the former site, but was also shut down the following year as part of Operation Onimus on 2015. Ulbricht was convicted in federal courts with multiple charges related to operating Silk Road and was given 2 life sentences without possibility of parole. There's also Utopia, which was another darknet market similar to the Silk Road that facilitated sales of illegal items such as narcotics, firearms, stolen bank account information, and forged identity documents. However, what is without doubt the darkest part of this page is its pornography section, which includes the following, all of which I'll note now are defunct, and many of the people involved with the creation of such sites have been arrested or are under investigation. The first one listed is Boys Town, which was a website on Tor. The website features various forums and chats for communication. The illegal images and videos were posted on the forums and the chats where members were able to communicate with one another. There were 2 chat services provided. One was called Lollipub and the other was known as Boys Pub. The child abuse materials exchanged between users were of young children and toddlers, most of which were boys from around the world. The content had various categories including art, which included Shotokan among other subcategories, hardcore, kindergarten, and toddler. Lollipub also had rules that included banning the promotion of hardcore, unquote. Next is Child's Play, which, as you might imagine, had the same sort of content there, and the owner of the site, Benjamin Faulkner, of North Bay, Ontario, Canada, was captured by the United States Department of Homeland Security. Benjamin Faulkner's associate, Patrick Fault, was also captured together with Faulkner when they met in Virginia in October 2016, 2 days after they had just raped a 4-year-old girl. Fault had been an administrator on the Gift Box Exchange, another darknet child exploitation site that was shut down in November 2016. Both were sentenced to life imprisonment for the rape of the girl, and subsequently sentenced to 35 years for engaging in child exploitation enterprise. Another such site was Lolita City, which had images and videos of underage males and females up to 17 years of age and down to literally newborns. This site, interestingly enough, was attacked by hacktivist collective Anonymous in the October of 2011 when they launched Operation Darknet in an attempt to disrupt the activities of child neural sites accessed through hidden services, and was successful as being an instrument in getting the site shut down, notably when they accessed specific users and what sort of content they had uploaded. Then we have Playpen. Yet again, I'm sure you understand what sort of content was on there based on the disgusting fucking title. This one was taken down by the FBI in what was called Operation Pacifier. During this time, the FBI used a malware-based network investigation technique, NIT, to hack into the web browsers of users accessing the site in what is known as a watering hole attack, thereby revealing their identities. The operation led to the arrest of 956 site users and 5 prison sentences. The investigation led to the sentencing of Stephen W. Chase, a 58-year-old man from Florida who created the website, to 30 years in prison in May of 2017. His co-defendants pleaded guilty and were sentenced to 20 years, each earlier in 2017 for their involvement in Playpen. However, in 2017, the FBI dropped charges against one defendant after the court for that case requested details on the NIT malware. The FBI preferred to keep the NIT malware a secret for further investigations, which is pretty fucked up. But yeah, I think you get the point here. Though, while we're on this page, I figured I'd make one last note. Under the social media and forum section, you'll notice Kiwi Farms is listed among them, which most of you are probably aware of by now. However, something of note is that this Wikipedia article actually lists incorrect information, with the top part saying, quote, Kiwi Farms, formerly known as Quickie Farms, is a web forum that facilitates the discussion and harassment of online figures and communities. Their targets are often subject to organized group trolling and stalking, as well as doxing and real-life harassment. These actions have tied Kiwi Farms to the suits of 3 people targeted by members of the forum, unquote, which is actually completely untrue. Despite popular belief, it's actually a myth that Kiwi Farms has ever been tied to any suits whatsoever, and these 3 cases that they note have been completely debunked. The article also notes, quote, the Kiwi Farms community considers it a goal to drive its targets to and has celebrated such deaths with a counter on the website, unquote. Which is also completely untrue. Number one, the site isn't a monolith, the same way YouTube isn't, and while there may be some users who are much more nasty than others, the same can be said for literally every other social media platform ever. And what's more is the site's owner Null, or Joshua Moon, has gone out of his way to discourage this action completely. Like him or hate him, he has stayed consistent on this. And if anything, there's someone on the website looking to try to cause people to self-harm themselves, those same people are very likely to be investigated and looked into by the forum users themselves. It sort of reminds me of back in the day, when the news used to talk about video games as being these truly violent, visceral things. And a common thing that you can find in many of these old news articles, news channels, and even from the government itself, is they would often say things like Grand Theft Auto is a rape simulator. This became so synonymous that people who had never played the game genuinely did think that Grand Theft Auto was a game where you could rape random people and that it was a detailed thing that you could do, that it was a core mechanic of the game, which of course is completely untrue, but it nevertheless was something that was said constantly, and it only took people who actually had played the game, grew up actually playing them, or looked into it even just a little bit to find out that the truth was that, while a violent game, certainly, it was not a game where you could just rape random people. And the same can definitely be said about Kiwi Farms. It is often a boogeyman website and forum for many people. Often it's a boogeyman site because there are, as we have come to find out, many pedophiles and people with extremely dicey and disturbing online backgrounds that do not like the website because it's one of the only places where all of their actions and past actions have been detailed for anyone to look up and see, basically having to make them take accountability for their actions. But regardless of any of that, I also mostly point this out because I guess the hidden secret final entry of this iceberg is that you really can't believe everything that you read on Wikipedia. It's a common saying that you can't trust Wikipedia, that it isn't the best source for all information, as it can often get things wrong. Not only just because it is run by people and people can just have false information on the website, but also certain editors can have political agendas that mess with the accuracy of certain pages. Not to mention, companies and journalists can just pay the website to change information. And in general, it's important to do your own research and not rely on one website for all your information about stuff. Wikipedia can be an excellent source for finding sources, I will say that, as you can often scroll down to the bottom of the page, or click the related source next to a given piece of information. But even bearing that in mind, certain sources that would actively disprove other sources can also not be there, which means while it can again be a good resource, sometimes you just gotta do a little bit of extra legwork if you want to know about stuff in greater detail. I guess the best way I could explain it is while Wikipedia may be able to give you the basic idea behind what lays behind the pages of a book, you're never going to get all the information, context, narrative weight, or feelings you would naturally obtain from actually just reading the book yourself. Or for a more modern example, reading an article about a video game doesn't replace actually playing the video game, now does it? You kinda have to treat all information like that, even from extremely trusted sources. By the way, this includes myself as well. I might make iceberg videos where I basically detail all the information and basics about a bunch of different topics to you, but I kind of look at icebergs as a really fun way of jumping into something deeper. And while I often do that in these iceberg videos myself, just because I find it fun, I think it's also a good opportunity for anything that seemed to stand out to you to look into further yourself. TLDR, research into topics is fun and informational, and you should totally do it more often, and not rely on Wikipedia as the end-all be-all. And that is it, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all for watching through the entirety of the disturbing Wikipedia Iceberg. It's been a pretty fun one to create, although I will say at times it definitely got pretty fucking dark, and sort of stayed consistently dark, far more than other icebergs I've covered. But all that being said, if you made it all the way through, thank you so very much. I hope you enjoyed the journey and are ready to join me on the next one. And the next one's gonna have a lot more story and narrative going on, so I look forward to that. While we're here, I also want to make sure I give a big thank you and shout out to all of my loyal patrons and channel members for continuing to support the channel and me in general, including all of my night eggs and my night owlets, as well as a very special thank you to all of my great night owls, including Get Schlombo, Sombre Devonte 06, Jeffrey Robbery, and Hex Maniac Hannah. And then I want to give a super duper special thank you to all of my arch owls, including the Wise Nicodemus, the Talented Cherry NGT, the Always Chi Vibes Zen Garden Party, the Daring Daniel Petrie, the Super Saiyan Star Punch Gaming, the Mysterious Mr. Gaming Sheep, the Fearless Forgotten Ace, and the Supersonic Sword. Thank you all so very much for supporting me and the channel. And I hope you're ready, because I've got some really big and cool stuff coming up over the next couple of months. And so, until next time, this has been Dylan the Night Owl, flying off.